For a long time, Jeff Bezos and Lauren Sanchez seemed to represent a new kind of power couple, the kind built not just on romance, but on spectacle. Every appearance looked curated. Every photo felt deliberate. Every headline seemed to push the same image, that this was a billionaire love story wrapped in glamour, confidence, and total control. But the danger of building a relationship in public is that the public eventually starts noticing the details you never meant to highlight. And lately, those details have become harder to ignore. The latest wave of attention did not begin with some anonymous insider or a shocking leaked message. It began with words spoken in public, and then amplified by the kind of reactions celebrity culture knows how to turn into wildfire. Rosie O'Donnell, never known for subtle criticism, openly attacked the lavishness of Jeff Bezos and Lauren Sanchez's Venice wedding in June 2025, calling out what she saw as grotesque excess surrounding the event. Entertainment Weekly and E! Both reported that Rosie blasted the scale and symbolism of the ceremony, not just the couple themselves. That matters, because Rosie was not merely commenting on a wedding, she was puncturing an image. Once that image starts to crack, people do what they always do. They go back and re-examine everything. The smiles start looking rehearsed. The poses start looking strategic. Moments that once seemed glamorous suddenly feel performative. And in the case of Lauren Sanchez, the timing could not have been more brutal. Over the past few days, fresh headlines have dragged her right back into the spotlight after she discussed the criticism surrounding her inauguration outfit and joked in a New York Times interview that she would have a baby tomorrow with Jeff Bezos. Multiple outlets later clarified that she is not pregnant, but the quote still exploded online. To some people, that may have sounded playful. To others, it sounded like something else entirely. A couple trying too hard to project closeness. A public figure trying to stay one step ahead of a shifting narrative. A woman at the center of a high-profile marriage who suddenly looked less like the untouchable partner of the world's elite and more like someone battling to hold the spotlight in place. That is where the rumor machine stepped in. The phrase that began floating around gossip spaces, that Jeff Bezos had somehow downgraded Lauren Sanchez, is not a confirmed fact. There is no credible report showing that he publicly diminished her status, pulled away from the marriage, or formally changed anything about how he presents her. What exists is interpretation. Harsh interpretation. The kind built from optics, tone, and timing rather than direct evidence. And rumor culture thrives on exactly that kind of ambiguity. Because once the internet senses a mismatch between image and reality, it starts inventing the emotional truth it wants to believe. Suddenly, Lauren's controversial public moments stop being isolated incidents and start feeling like symptoms. The inauguration outfit backlash was already enough to draw renewed criticism, with People and Page 6 both reporting that she defended the look and later joked, "No lace at the White House," noted. Then came the baby comment, which only intensified the sense that the couple's personal narrative was still being performed for public consumption. On paper, these are just headlines. In rumor territory, they become evidence of pressure, evidence of insecurity, evidence that the fairy tale is being managed far more aggressively than anyone wants to admit. And that is why Rosie O'Donnell's criticism hit so hard. She did not need to accuse Jeff of abandoning Lauren. She did not need to present a secret scandal. She simply attacked the emptiness of the display. She took the fantasy of billionaire romance and reframed it as a monument to vanity. Once that happens, the woman standing beside the billionaire does not automatically look elevated anymore. Sometimes she looks exposed. Sometimes she looks like part of the set design. And that is a far more dangerous narrative than any one insult, because it changes how the audience sees every future appearance. So now people are asking a question that would have sounded absurd when this relationship first became public. Is Lauren Sanchez still being presented as the great glamorous upgrade in Jeff Bezos' life? Or is the image beginning to slide into something colder, something less romantic, something more transactional than anyone expected? That is the tension sitting underneath all of this. Not a proven breakup, not a confirmed humiliation, but a growing suspicion that the public story is losing its shine, and that Rosie O'Donnell may have said out loud what a lot of people were already starting to feel. What makes this story so magnetic is not just what Rosie O'Donnell said, but what her words unlocked. In celebrity culture, a single sharp public comment can do more damage than a dozen anonymous rumors because it gives people permission to say what they were already thinking. And once Rosie framed Jeff Bezos and Lauren Sanchez not as aspirational, but as excessive, indulgent, and disconnected, the entire tone around them began to shift. That shift matters more than most people realize. For years, Lauren Sanchez was presented as the bold new chapter in Jeff Bezos' life. She was not just his partner. She was the symbol of reinvention. Glamorous, confident, camera-ready, fearless in elite spaces that merge media, politics, and billionaire influence. Standing beside Jeff, she seemed to embody the version of his life that came after divorce, after Amazon's rise, after becoming one of the most recognizable men on Earth. She was not framed as an accessory. She was framed as a statement. But public perception is cruel because it can turn overnight. The same confidence that once looked powerful can suddenly look calculated. The same visibility that once felt exciting can start to feel exhausting. And the same woman once described as elevating a billionaire's image can become the target of whispers that she is now overexposed, overmanaged, and increasingly vulnerable to ridicule. That is exactly what seems to be happening here. Not because of one single event, but because of an accumulation of moments that no longer feel effortless. And that is where the deeper tension begins. When people first buy into a celebrity couple, they want a fantasy. They want chemistry, elegance, and the illusion that these two people are operating on some higher level of confidence the rest of the world cannot touch. But once that illusion weakens, every public move gets reinterpreted through suspicion. A smile starts looking forced. A glamorous appearance starts looking like damage control. A bold quote starts sounding rehearsed. Nothing is neutral anymore. That is especially dangerous for Lauren because she has always been such a visible part of the brand. Jeff Bezos can disappear into silence when he wants. He can lean on wealth, power, and distance. He can afford to say nothing and let the world keep guessing. Lauren does not have that luxury in the same way. Her presence is part of the spectacle, which means when the narrative turns, she absorbs more of the heat. And once critics decide that the spectacle itself is the problem, the woman most associated with maintaining it becomes the easiest target. That is why the idea of being downgraded has become so potent, even without hard proof. Because in the language of gossip, downgraded does not always mean officially rejected. Sometimes it means something colder than that. It means the public no longer sees you as untouchable. It means your status in the story feels less secure than it once did. It means the fantasy around you is shrinking. And in a media environment obsessed with status, that kind of symbolic fall can look almost as devastating as a real one. Rosie O'Donnell did not invent that fear, but she sharpened it. Her criticism gave the internet a villain, a theme, and a frame. Suddenly, this was not just about a wedding or a headline. It became a referendum on what Jeff and Lauren actually represent. Not love, not triumph, not destiny, but wealth on display, vanity on display, detachment on display. Once that interpretation takes hold, every future appearance risks feeding it. The couple can show up smiling, but people will call it staged. They can stay quiet, but people will call it tension. They can act normal and still be read as fragile. And that is the trap of extreme visibility. The more polished the image, the more satisfying the crack becomes when it appears. People love to watch untouchable couples become readable. They love the moment glamour stops looking magical and starts looking expensive. They love the possibility that behind the yachts, the designer looks, the choreographed entrances, and the billionaire aura, there may be the same insecurity, distance, and quiet imbalance. that destroys far less famous relationships every day. So when people say Rosie O'Donnell broke the silence, what they really mean is that she broke the protection around the silence. She said something rude, blunt, and deeply inconvenient at the exact moment when the public was already beginning to wonder whether Jeff Bezos and Lauren Sanchez were still selling a fantasy that no longer felt believable. And once that happens, the story stops being about what is true behind closed doors. It becomes about what the world now feels entitled to suspect in public. And once suspicion becomes the real headline, image alone is never enough to stop it. There is another reason this story refuses to die, and it has very little to do with whether Rosie O'Donnell likes Lauren Sanchez personally. The real reason is that Rosie touched a nerve that has existed around this relationship from the very beginning. Long before the latest backlash, long before the fresh interviews and the renewed mockery, there was always a quiet question hanging over Jeff Bezos and Lauren Sanchez. Was this a love story the public was witnessing? Or was it a power story dressed up as romance? That question never fully went away. It was easy to ignore when everything looked shiny, when the photos were glamorous, when the appearances were controlled, when the headlines framed them as a fearless billionaire couple rewriting the rules of modern celebrity. In that version of the story, Lauren looked like a woman ascending. She was not merely attached to one of the richest men in the world. She looked like she belonged there, like she understood the camera, the timing, the message, and the game better than almost anyone else. She seemed fluent in power. But power couples live and die by one thing above all else: balance. The audience does not just want beauty and wealth. It wants to believe both people in the relationship are equally secure in their roles. The second that balance feels off, the second one person appears to be carrying more of the image than the other, the fantasy starts collapsing from the inside. And lately, that is exactly the feeling surrounding Lauren Sanchez. Not that she has disappeared, not that she has been publicly cast aside, but that she may now be working harder to preserve the aura than the aura is working to protect her. That is a devastating shift, because once a woman in Lauren's position begins to look like she is maintaining the spectacle rather than effortlessly living inside it, the public becomes merciless. Every gesture gets re-examined. Every outfit becomes symbolic. Every quote becomes either proof of confidence or proof of strain. There is almost no middle ground left. And in a culture obsessed with reading body language, social positioning, and public tone like secret code, even small moments become loaded with meaning they may never have intended to carry. This is where Rosie O'Donnell's role becomes even more important. Rosie did not come into this story as a polished commentator or a carefully neutral observer. She came in like a wrecking ball. That kind of criticism has a different effect than tabloid gossip because it feels less sneaky and more confrontational. It does not whisper. It announces. It forces people to choose whether they agree, disagree, or at least entertain the possibility that the glamour in front of them has turned grotesque. And once Rosie made excess the main theme, it became much harder for Lauren to remain just a glamorous bride in the public imagination. She started becoming something else, a symbol of excess herself. And symbols are dangerous things to become, because the moment a public figure stops being seen as a person and starts being seen as a symbol, the audience no longer reacts to them with patience. It reacts with projection. Some people project envy, some project resentment, some project moral disgust. Others project a darker fascination, the kind that wants to see what happens when a woman who seems to have everything suddenly looks unstable inside the very world that once celebrated her. That may be the cruelest part of this entire narrative. Lauren Sanchez is still rich, still visible, still part of one of the most watched relationships on the planet. Yet none of that guarantees immunity. In fact, it may be making things worse. Because the richer the image, the more dramatic the fall looks in the minds of viewers, even if the fall is only symbolic. In gossip culture, losing emotional control of the narrative can look almost identical to losing real status. That is why phrases like downgraded spread so fast. They are not legal terms. They are emotional verdicts. Brutal little summaries of a public mood. And public mood can be more destructive than facts. Facts require evidence. Mood only requires momentum. Right now, the mood around Jeff Bezos and Lauren Sanchez feels different than it once did. Less enchanted, less admiring, more skeptical, more mocking, more eager to question whether the chemistry on display is genuine, whether the love story is solid, and whether Lauren is still the dazzling centerpiece of Jeff's post-divorce reinvention or simply the most visible target when that reinvention starts looking hollow. That is what Rosie may have understood before most people said it openly. She did not need to expose a secret. She only needed to puncture the illusion at the exact moment the audience was already tired of protecting it. And once the illusion weakens, every future headline becomes fuel. Every controversy becomes part of a larger pattern. Every public appearance becomes another test of whether the couple can still command admiration or whether they are now trapped in a cycle where attention comes laced with ridicule. And for someone like Lauren Sanchez, ridicule is not a small thing. Ridicule changes status. It changes how people watch you, how they interpret your confidence, how they measure your importance next to the man beside you. The same woman once presented as the glamorous next chapter in Jeff Bezos' life can suddenly be recast as someone fighting to remain central in a story that is no longer fully hers to control. That is why this rumor feels bigger than one comment, one wedding, or one headline. It is really about what happens when a public love story stops feeling like aspiration and starts feeling like overexposure. It is about the moment a carefully crafted image begins turning against the people who built it. And most of all, it is about the possibility that Rosie O'Donnell did not start the collapse of the fantasy at all. She may have simply arrived at the moment it was already beginning and said the one thing no one could unhear. What makes the entire situation even more fascinating is that this is no longer just a story about a celebrity couple being criticized. It is becoming a story about hierarchy, about who holds the real power inside an image that was supposed to look seamless. And once people begin looking at a relationship through that lens, everything changes. Because power is not always loud. Sometimes power is the person who speaks less, the person who reveals less, the person who can remain still while everyone else around them explains, defends, performs, and absorbs the reaction. In that sense, Jeff Bezos has always had one enormous advantage in this relationship. He does not need to fight for visibility. He already owns it. He does not need to prove importance. The world already assumes it. That means when controversy hits, he can afford distance in a way Lauren Sanchez cannot. And that imbalance may be exactly why the public conversation has become so unforgiving. When a couple is seen as equally powerful, backlash tends to spread across both people. But when one person appears to be the fixed center, and the other appears to be the more visible interpreter of the relationship, the second person almost always gets hit harder. That is because the audience starts imagining a silent chain of command. One person becomes the source of status, the other becomes the one trying to preserve access to it. Even if that interpretation is unfair, once it takes hold, it becomes incredibly difficult to reverse. That is the deeper fear hiding beneath the downgraded narrative. Not that Jeff Bezos has literally cast Lauren aside, not that some official humiliation has taken place behind the scenes, but that the public is beginning to see her as more dependent on the image than he is, more vulnerable to mockery, more exposed to the mood swings of the crowd. And in celebrity culture, dependency is fatal to mystique. The second people think one half of a glamorous couple needs the image more, they start treating that person as weaker, more desperate, and easier to diminish. That is how symbolic demotions happen in public. They do not require announcements. They do not require scandal. They happen through tone, through jokes, through a change in how headlines feel, through the slow drift from admiration to side-eye, from fascination to fatigue, from fantasy to suspicion. One day the public is calling you glamorous. The next day, it is asking whether you are overcompensating. And by the time that shift is obvious, the damage is usually already underway. Lauren Sanchez now finds herself in exactly that kind of dangerous territory. The problem is not simply that people are criticizing her. Public women can survive criticism. The real problem is that the criticism is becoming thematic. It is no longer one isolated complaint here and one awkward headline there. It is starting to form a narrative spine. Excess, performance, overexposure, image management. Those words begin to cluster together, and once they do, the audience starts reading every new appearance as confirmation rather than coincidence. That is what makes Rosie O'Donnell's intervention so explosive in hindsight. She did not just throw an insult into the void. She helped give the criticism a shape. She took vague discomfort and made it feel organized. She turned scattered eye rolls into a sharper cultural judgment. Once that happens, a celebrity does not just face backlash, they face interpretation. And interpretation is much harder to defeat, because it is no longer about one event. It becomes about what people think your whole public existence means. For Lauren, that creates a brutal dilemma. If she stays visible, critics say she is trying too hard. If she steps back, critics say the silence proves something is wrong. If she appears confident, they call it calculated. If she appears softer, they call it shaken. This is what happens when a public figure gets trapped inside a hostile narrative. Neutrality disappears. Every move begins working for the people who already doubt you. And Jeff's silence, whether intentional or not, only deepens that effect. Silence can look disciplined. It can look powerful. It can look like indifference to noise. But when one partner stays above the chaos while the other becomes the face most associated with the chaos, the audience starts reading that silence as distance. Maybe emotional distance, maybe strategic distance. Maybe just the distance of a man whose position is secure enough that he does not need to rescue the image in real time. Whatever the reason, the result feels the same. Lauren starts to look more alone inside the narrative than a woman in her position is supposed to look. That is where the story becomes psychologically compelling. Because what the public is really responding to is not just glamour, it is vulnerability breaking through glamour. People are sensing the possibility that beneath the polished entrances, the elegant fashion, and the billionaire theater, there may be a much more familiar imbalance at work. One person setting the temperature, the other person adapting to it. One person staying powerful in silence, the other being forced to survive invisibility. And if that is the frame the audience keeps choosing, then every future headline becomes dangerous. Not because it proves a collapse, but because it keeps the possibility of collapse alive. That is the genius and the cruelty of rumor culture. It does not need certainty. It only needs enough tension to keep the imagination engaged. And right now, Jeff Bezos and Lauren Sanchez are giving the public exactly that. Not with proof, not with confession, but with the far more intoxicating thing, a relationship that still looks glamorous on the surface while increasingly inviting people to wonder who, beneath all that shine, is actually holding the stronger position. And once the audience starts asking that question, it almost never stops. The reason this narrative has become so addictive is because it is no longer operating like ordinary celebrity gossip. It has evolved into something more layered, more psychological, and far more dangerous for the people at the center of it. This is no longer just about what Rosie O'Donnell said, or what Lauren Sanchez wore, or what Jeff Bezos did not say. It is about the emotional structure the public now believes it is seeing. And once the public thinks it has discovered the emotional structure of a relationship, it becomes nearly impossible to convince people otherwise. That is the hidden power of rumor. It takes fragments and turns them into a pattern. A comment becomes a clue. A silence becomes a strategy. A smile becomes a mask. Suddenly, every public moment is no longer being viewed on its own terms. It is being absorbed into a larger story already taking shape in the minds of viewers. And in this case, that larger story is brutally simple. Jeff looks secure. Lauren looks exposed. Jeff looks above the noise. Lauren looks trapped inside it. Whether that is fair is almost beside the point. Because fairness has never been the engine of celebrity culture. Perception is, and perception right now is moving in a direction that should worry anyone who understands how quickly public fascination can become public cruelty. The same audience that once admired Lauren Sanchez for her confidence, her boldness, and her ability to stand beside one of the most powerful men in the world now seems increasingly interested in a darker question. What if that confidence is not the sign of comfort anymore? What if it is the sign of pressure? That possibility changes everything. A confident woman in the public eye is powerful. A woman who looks like she must remain confident at all costs becomes vulnerable. The difference is subtle, but devastating. One version is admired. The other is scrutinized. One seems in control of the image, the other seems controlled by the need to maintain it. And once viewers start sensing that second version, they become obsessed with spotting proof. Every outfit, every quote, every public appearance becomes another opportunity to decide whether Lauren is still naturally commanding attention or now anxiously performing for it. That is why the conversation around being downgraded has become so emotionally loaded. It is not really about rank in any official sense. It is about emotional positioning. It is about whether the woman once seen as the glamorous embodiment of Jeff Bezos' new life is still being experienced by the public as central and untouchable, or whether she is beginning to feel replaceable inside the image itself. That is the kind of fear gossip culture knows how to weaponize with terrifying efficiency. Because once a woman is perceived as replaceable, even symbolically, the entire tone of how she is discussed changes. People become less generous, less curious, more mocking, more clinical. They stop watching her to be impressed and start watching her to measure instability. They stop asking how powerful she is and start asking how long she can hold her position. It becomes a countdown atmosphere, even when there is no confirmed collapse taking place. And that countdown energy is one of the most corrosive things a celebrity can face, because it means every future appearance is judged not as a fresh moment, but as a checkpoint in a decline. People are already anticipating. That is why Rosie O'Donnell's voice mattered so much at this exact moment. She did not create the fragility. She named the vulgarity around the spectacle in a way that made people feel justified in abandoning the fantasy. Once the fantasy loses moral cover, it loses emotional protection too. People no longer feel guilty for being cynical. They no longer feel compelled to admire the wealth, the style, the choreography, or the romance. They begin to see all of it as overproduced theater. And in overproduced theater, the person most visibly playing the role often gets blamed harder than the person financing the stage. That may be the harshest part of all this for Lauren, because she is not merely being criticized as an individual. She is being interpreted as a symbol of excess, of ambition, of display, of the polished femininity that so often gets celebrated right up until the moment the crowd decides it is too much. Then suddenly the same traits that once looked magnetic become reasons to sneer. The same confidence becomes vanity. The same glamour becomes emptiness. The same visibility becomes evidence that something underneath it all might not be as secure as it appears. This is how celebrity narratives turn predatory. The audience does not just consume the image anymore. It starts hunting for weakness inside it. It begins looking for the hesitation in the smile, the strain in the quote, the imbalance in the body language, the emotional asymmetry that could explain why one half of the couple still looks rock solid, while the other seems increasingly forced to prove that everything is fine. And the more Lauren appears, the harder that becomes. Because when public suspicion hardens, presence alone can work against you. You show up, and they call it performance. You speak, and they call it management. You laugh, and they call it deflection. You stay silent, and they call it fear. There is almost no winning once a woman becomes the vessel through which people are processing their broader resentment toward wealth, privilege, and spectacle. That is where this story stops being just gossip and starts becoming tragedy in slow motion. Not necessarily the tragedy of a marriage collapsing behind closed doors, not necessarily the tragedy of betrayal or scandal, but the tragedy of watching a woman who once seemed to glide through elite spaces with ease become the focus of a narrative that now interprets her every move as a sign of instability. A woman can still have money, status, access, and visibility, and yet be losing something much harder to recover: untouchability. And once untouchability is gone, every rumor lands harder. Every criticism cuts deeper. Every silence becomes suspicious. Every attempt to reclaim control risks confirming the very weakness it is trying to deny. That is why this story feels far from over. Because what people are now watching is not just whether Jeff Bezos and Lauren Sanchez remain together. They are watching to see who continues to look powerful inside the relationship and who begins to look like they are carrying the emotional cost of the spotlight. And in the ruthless language of public perception, that difference can become the whole story long before any real truth ever emerges. Even darker is the possibility that this story is no longer being driven by events at all. It is being driven by atmosphere. And atmosphere is far harder to escape because it does not rely on proof. It relies on feeling. Right now, the feeling around Jeff Bezos and Lauren Sanchez is not the same as it once was. It is no longer built on envy alone. It is now mixed with skepticism, irritation, and an almost obsessive curiosity about whether the glamorous surface is hiding a quieter imbalance underneath. That is the point where public narratives become dangerous. Because once atmosphere replaces evidence, people stop waiting for something definitive to happen. They begin treating the mood itself as the revelation. They do not need a breakup announcement. They do not need a leaked argument. They do not need a source close to the couple. They simply start reading the emotional weather around every appearance, every quote, every silence, and convincing themselves that the truth is already visible for anyone sharp enough to see it. That kind of scrutiny is ruthless, and it is especially ruthless toward women whose power has always been tied, at least in part, to image. Lauren Sanchez has never been invisible. She has never tried to disappear into a quieter, more private role. Her presence has always been part of the architecture of the story. Bold, glamorous, polished, highly visible. That strategy can feel unbeatable when the public is on your side. But when the mood turns, visibility becomes exposure. The same spotlight that once made you shine begins revealing every tiny crack the audience wants to believe is there. This is why the downgraded rumor has taken on such a strange life of its own. It is not spreading because people have hard information. It is spreading because it gives a satisfying emotional shape to what they think they are seeing. Jeff remains the immovable center, the billionaire whose status does not seem to tremble under criticism. Lauren, meanwhile, becomes the emotional screen onto which everyone projects instability, insecurity, overcompensation, or strain. In that frame, she becomes easier to narrate as the one losing altitude, even if the reality behind closed doors is far more complicated. And rumor culture loves simplicity more than truth. A simple story always wins. A rich, powerful man appears steady. The glamorous woman beside him appears increasingly scrutinized. The public decides the balance has shifted. From there, everything starts reinforcing itself. A new photo is interpreted as coldness. A public joke is interpreted as compensation. A stylish appearance is interpreted as effort. Even happiness, if displayed too visibly, can be interpreted as proof that something beneath it is fragile. This is where the emotional cruelty becomes almost invisible, because it is disguised as observation. People tell themselves they are just noticing patterns, just reading signals, just paying attention. But what they are often really doing is participating in a slow, symbolic stripping away of someone's authority. Not legal authority, not financial authority, image authority. The ability to appear beyond ridicule, the ability to move through public life without every gesture being translated into weakness. That is the power Lauren seems at risk of losing. And once that kind of power begins slipping, it can be very hard to reclaim. Because glamour only works when people agree to collaborate with it. The audience has to meet the image halfway. They have to suspend their hostility long enough to let the fantasy function. The moment they refuse, the fantasy starts collapsing under its own weight. Suddenly the clothes are too much. The entrances are too polished. The quotes are too perfect. The confidence is too visible. And that word too starts haunting everything. Too glamorous, too public, too managed, too eager, too obvious. It is one of the fastest ways a woman in public life can be turned from aspirational into vulnerable. And that may be why Rosie O'Donnell's words still echo through this story, even after the initial shock fades. Rosie gave language to a discomfort that was already rising. She did not merely criticize a wedding or a display of wealth. She helped turn excess into the lens through which many people now watch the couple. Once excess becomes the frame, tenderness looks staged. Elegance looks performative. Romance looks expensive rather than sincere. That is a brutal transformation because it strips emotional credibility from almost everything the couple does in public, which means the real damage may not be in any single headline at all. The real damage may be in the growing belief that Lauren Sanchez is no longer defining the image but defending it. And there is a world of difference between those two positions. One is power. The other is pressure. One suggests ease. The other suggests dependence. One says the spotlight belongs to you. The other says you are trapped inside it and cannot afford to let it dim. That is where the story becomes almost tragic. Not because anyone has confirmed humiliation, not because anyone has exposed a secret collapse, but because the public has started watching Lauren not as a woman secure in her place, but as a woman whose place now feels strangely vulnerable to interpretation. And in the world of elite celebrity culture, vulnerability to interpretation can become a kind of public weakening all by itself. The audience senses it. The media feeds it. The rumor machine sharpens it. And the person at the center has to keep walking through the cameras as if none of it is touching them. That is not easy. In fact, it may be one of the hardest roles in modern fame. Because once people stop asking whether you look glamorous and start asking whether you look secure, you are already in a far more dangerous story than the one you thought you were living in. By the time a story reaches this stage, the facts almost stop mattering. Not completely, but enough that they are no longer the force shaping the public imagination. What shapes the imagination now is momentum. The sense that something has shifted, something subtle but undeniable, and that once the shift begins, everyone wants to be the first to say they saw it coming. That is where Jeff Bezos and Lauren Sanchez now seem to be living. Not inside a confirmed scandal, not inside a proven collapse, but inside a narrative climate where every appearance feels like a test, every expression feels like evidence. Every public move feels as though it must either restore the fantasy or quietly confirm that the fantasy is already slipping out of reach. And for couples built as much on image as intimacy, that kind of pressure can become suffocating even when nothing concrete has technically gone wrong, because the crowd is no longer watching to admire. It is watching to detect. That is one of the cruelest transitions any public figure can go through. The same people who once looked at you with fascination begin looking at you like investigators. They are no longer asking what you are wearing, where you are going, or how glamorous the moment feels. They are asking what the moment reveals. Who looks more confident? Who looks more tense? Who leads? Who follows? Who seems centered? Who seems like they are trying to stay centered? Once the audience begins watching through that lens, ordinary appearances become emotionally dangerous. And Lauren Sanchez may be facing the sharpest version of that danger, because she is not just being watched as a celebrity, she is being watched as a signal of whether this relationship still radiates the same power it once did, a signal of whether she remains secure in the role the world assigned her, a signal of whether the woman who once seemed to embody Jeff Bezos's gleaming next chapter still looks like the author of that chapter, or merely one of its most visible participants. That difference is everything. A participant can be recast, a symbol can be reinterpreted, a glamorous figure can be turned into a cautionary one with astonishing speed. All it takes is a few badly timed headlines, a few moments the internet decides to mock rather than admire, and one powerful reframing from a critic like Rosie O'Donnell. After that, the public does the rest. It starts composing a new version of the story, one where the romance feels less like destiny and more like branding under stress. And branding under stress always reveals hierarchy. This may be the real reason people cannot stop talking about who is being elevated and who is being diminished. Because deep down, the audience is not just fascinated by romance, it is fascinated by rank. It wants to know who has the stronger footing, who could walk away with their aura intact, who needs the image more, who can survive the mockery, and who absorbs it into their skin. Right now, Jeff appears to occupy the safer position in that equation. Not because anyone has proven he is pulling away, but because he has the privilege of structural power. Wealth at that level creates insulation. Silence becomes authority. Distance becomes composure. A lack of visible reaction becomes its own kind of dominance. Lauren, by contrast, remains the face through which much of the criticism is emotionally processed. That alone creates an imbalance in perception, even if the emotional reality of their relationship is more equal than outsiders imagine. And perception is the battlefield now. Not truth, not proof, perception. That is why this rumor has become so resilient. It feeds on a simple emotional picture the public finds compelling. The billionaire still looks fortified. The glamorous wife looks increasingly forced to hold the line. He seems buffered by power. She seems exposed by visibility. Whether that picture is fair barely matters. Once enough people start repeating it, repetition gives it weight. Weight gives it legitimacy. And legitimacy gives it the power to reshape how every future moment is seen. This is how a public woman can begin losing status before anything measurable has actually been lost. The crowd senses vulnerability and starts treating it as fact. That is the true danger of a narrative like Downgraded. It is not that it announces some official change. It is that it teaches the audience how to look at you. Once people are taught to view you as less secure, less protected, less central, they start finding proof of that everywhere. In your posture, in your smile, in your words, in your clothes, in the very effort it takes to keep showing up as if nothing has shifted. And maybe that is the cruelest irony of all. The more Lauren appears determined, composed, and polished, the more some viewers may interpret that composure as strain. The more flawlessly she performs confidence, the more convinced they become that confidence must now be a performance. It is a trap with almost no clean escape. Retreat looks like weakness. Visibility looks like overcompensation. Silence looks ominous. Speech looks defensive. Once a woman falls into that interpretive prison, even her strongest moves can be used against her. That is why this does not feel like ordinary gossip anymore. It feels like the slow rewriting of a role. The woman once introduced to the world as an almost cinematic symbol of reinvention may now be entering a far harsher chapter, one where the audience is no longer content to watch her shine. It wants to know whether she can endure being watched while shining becomes harder. It wants to know whether she still owns the image, or whether the image now owns her. And that is the question hanging over everything now. Not whether one rude comment caused all of this, not whether one wedding or one interview changed reality overnight, but whether the public has crossed a line in how it sees Lauren Sanchez from glamorous certainty to precarious visibility. Because once that line is crossed, the cameras do not just record you anymore. They test you.